So I'm going to be talking to you today, as David mentioned, about some changes that we've been monitoring in the Taiga Plains region, near a spot near Fort Simpson. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborator, Dr. Bill Quinton, who I'm working very closely with. We've been trying to develop a fairly integrative approach to monitoring hydrological and vegetation changes, and I'll be presenting some of both of these results today. Okay, so we're working right down around here at a basin called Scotty Creek, and we like to refer to this as the front lines of permafrost thaw. I think probably Steve Coquel would argue with me about that, but we're down here in the zone of discontinuous permafrost, and we heard a lot about discontinuous permafrost in Yellowknife, and so in this area it's very similar, just a different type of substrate. So patchy permafrost that's fairly thin, fairly warm, and as a consequence, it's very sensitive to changes in the climate. And because it's discontinuous, we see both lateral and vertical thaw. And what lateral thaw means in the system is disappearance of permafrost, so shrinking of these patches in the landscape. So this can have fairly large implications for landscape, in terms of landscape change and in terms of the function of these ecosystems. Okay, so in the system, the presence of permafrost drives the distribution of vegetation. What we're seeing here, and I apologize to this group over here, I'm going to be turning my back a little as I point to parts on the slide, but what we're seeing here is a LiDAR image of a small portion of the basin, and we see a little bit of topography. It looks like it may be more than it is, but all this is topographic relief of about 1/2 meter to about 1.5 meters. And all of this, it's a very flat terrain, and all of this is driven by the presence of permafrost. So areas that have permafrost are raised up above the surrounding surface by about 1/2 meter to 1.5 meters. And this drives really important vegetation and hydrological characteristics of this site. As you can see here, this is World View 2 imagery for the site, and you can see very, very striking correspondence between the distribution of forest in the site and the distribution of permafrost. So here we see this nice flat bog down here, and it's depicted by this low area. So very close coupling of forest vegetation and permafrost. And also the topographic features associated with permafrost formation in the system drive drainage patterns in the system. So here we have these permafrost plateaus. So this is, this is Goose Lake. We call this one First Lake. Our research camp is right around there, and this is a nice channel fen moving between the two lakes. And here we have our forested permafrost plateaus that are raised up. And these act to basically shed water into, they basically act as runoff generators. They shed water into the adjacent wetlands. And our wetland types are, we have these channel fens which connect lakes and also act to drain the system, so they act as very slow-moving rivers in the system. And then these sort of yellowy patches here that you see on the landscape, these are flat bogs, sphagnum-dominated bogs, and they're largely isolated hydrologically from the rest of the system via permafrost. You sort of have these bogs encapsulated by permafrost, and so because of the impermeable nature of the permafrost, water is stored. So we have these bogs that store water, these channel fens which drain water, and permafrost plateaus which act as sort of runoff generators to the adjacent wetlands. And so you can see this sort of cross-section here. Okay, so then what happens in a system like this when we see climate change? And these are some data for the entirety. So this is gridded climate data for the entirety of the Taiga Plains ecoregion. So we move here from sort of the Scotty Creek area all the way up to Inuvik or Tuktoyaktuk. So here's a latitudinal gradient. And this is annual mean temperatures, and over here we have annual minimum temperatures. The red dots correspond to 1986 to 2005, and the blue dots correspond to 1940 to 1959. So two sort of distinct periods of time. And we see basically, we see an upward shift across latitudes in air temperatures, but more strikingly so in annual minimum temperatures. So winters are getting warmer, and this is largely driving this increase in annual mean temperatures. So this is happening consistently across the Taiga Plains ecoregion. And we're interested in, well, what happens when you have these areas of discontinuous permafrost faced with this kind of warming? And some data that Bill has been collecting since the late 90s on the width of this particular permafrost plateau. So every year they measure active layer thickness, much like the previous speakers are doing at their sites. Every year they measure the width of this permafrost plateau using frost probes. And you can see this striking change in terms of the width of the plateau. In 1999, it was about 42 meters across. By 2008, we're down to only 26 meters across. And so this is a really dramatic loss. And this, as we know, because forests occur on these areas, this also corresponds to dramatic change in vegetation, moving from these forested peat plateaus to these unforested, untreed sphagnum bogs. And this is what thawing permafrost looks like in this system. You have your peat plateau elevated above the adjacent wetlands, and you have this really wet moat where water's running out of the system as the permafrost thaws in that sort of front. We've got trees sitting on the edges of these. If you think of black spruce, they have these great long lateral rooting systems, and we've done some measurements on the roots that are extending into these bogs, and they just shut down. So these trees sort of face a slow death as permafrost moves forward. Radial growth slows, water uptake slows, and productivity on these plateaus decreases in response to that. And you can imagine this isn't a very nice place to live if you can't form particular types of roots. So in terms of the changes that we're seeing, it's not just happening on that one plateau. What this image is showing, the green parts are permafrost plateaus, treed permafrost plateaus. The white areas are wetlands. This is that lake that we already saw in a picture. And this is a little counter showing you the dates. So we developed this using aerial photos where we manually digitized the extent of trees. And you can see the cover percents from 1947 up to 2008. But more visually, you can see the sort of degradation of these permafrost plateaus and loss of forest from the system that's happening at a very rapid rate. And what I'd like to draw your attention to as well is sort of the increasing connectivity. If you watch this one down here, it sort of grows and these different bogs coalesce into a single bog. Or up here, we see bogs connecting with fens. And this is happening at an increasing rate. So here we have annual rates of forest loss, which again correspond with permafrost thaw. I'm a forest ecologist, so I favor this kind of axis, but what we see is in the period between 1977 and 2000, we see annual loss rates of about 0.15%. By 2000 to 2010 period, our annual loss rates have nearly tripled. And part of this has to do with that process that I showed you that was happening in that little movie where the landscape is becoming more and more fragmented. As the patches of permafrost decrease, their edges are becoming exposed increasingly to the warm water bodies adjacent to them. And so we see this response with rate of thaw being determined in part by sort of the edginess of the system. The more fragmented the system, and that's what this metric is corresponding to, the greater the rates of thaw. And this, of course, has implications not only in terms of the vegetation cover, but in terms of hydrology of the system. So I pointed this out when the little movie was going through of this bog that became connected to a fen. But what we have happening in the system, so here we have that same fen, here we have a flat bog, and in 1977, this bog, the permafrost between this bog and this fen breached. And you can see that breach has widened in subsequent years from 1977 to 2008. Now, the implications of this from a hydrological perspective are largely a function of the hydraulic gradients in the system, but if this area is a bit more elevated than the fen, which our DEMs tell us it is, then this bog should in fact then be contributing to runoff that flows out of the system toward the basin outlet, and so effectively draining this system. Whereas previously these bogs were isolated and water was stored in them. So what this should mean for the system is increased discharge, and in sort of an unsustainable way. And in fact, what we're seeing in this system, so here we have years, and this is discharge from 4 different basins in the area: Jean Marie, which we'll hear about a bit more about tomorrow, I believe, the Birch, the Blackstone, and Scotty Creek. And we see basin discharge that was fairly stable for about 3 decades, and then in about 1995, we see this sort of trend upward in the basin discharge. And this is in the absence of any kind of trend in the precipitation data. We aren't seeing increases or decreases in average annual precipitation anyway for this system. So we suspect that this is due to some of this increase in hydrological connectivity in the system, with some of these bogs becoming connected and dumping their water into the runoff from the system. And I'm not sure about my time right now. Doing okay? All right. So the last bit of data I want to show you is this idea that this is probably more widespread than just Scotty Creek, and I'm sure some of you who spend a lot of time in these sorts of areas have seen similar changes. This is a fairly indistinguishable map, but this is Great Slave Lake here. Here's our Scotty Creek Basin over here. And what we were interested in looking at, we were interested in using remote sensing tools to see if we could measure this at a larger scale at the landscape. And this is a bit of ongoing work, but I thought I'd show you some preliminary findings today. So we're working over here in the Taiga Plains region, and we wanted to see if we could measure this using a metric that's we based this map on high resolution MODIS data. So that was available from 2000 to 2012. And from this, you can calculate basically indices about how much vegetation biomass is in a particular spot. So what is your above ground biomass is basically the metric we're measuring here. So where we have positive trends, we're seeing increased productivity, increased growth. Where we have negative trends, we're seeing loss of reduced productivity, and this corresponds to reduction in your above ground biomass. And what we see is that in much of the southern part of the Taiga Plains, we're seeing negative trends. And we think that this is likely corresponding to the kinds of patterns that we're seeing at Scotty Creek, with decreased forest cover as a consequence of permafrost thaw and sort of the collapse of forest into these adjacent wetlands. And this is happening in a very widespread way in the southern part of the Taiga Plains. And as you move further north, where permafrost becomes more extensive, discontinuous, I guess, we see this happening less frequently. So we're still parsing out some of the signals in this, but there is definitely suggestive patterns here that we can use this tool to quantify the extent of this change and the rates of change attributable to thaw. So definitely some strong evidence that this is much more widespread than our single study site. So just a quick summary, climate warming in this area is leading to fairly rapid permafrost thaw, and what this is leading to in terms of landscape changes is loss of forest cover, conversion of forests into wetlands. But it's also resulting in increased connectivity, increased hydrological connectivity of the landscape that is potentially contributing to increased runoff in an unsustainable way. Again, that's not being supported by increased precipitation. So we see these sort of landscape level changes that we think are attributable to this climate warming induced permafrost thaw. Now Brian had asked me to sort of touch on the implications of this for caribou in particular, but I think probably we could think about the consequences of some of these landscape changes for a number of important wildlife species. But this is a little quote taken from the NWT Species at Risk Committee report on the boreal caribou. With climate change, loss of forest habitats due to permafrost thaw may have significant future effects on boreal caribou populations. Now, certainly the rates of change that we're seeing in this particular system are fairly striking, and suggest that some of these important habitats, and certainly caribou do use muskeg type habitats as an important component of their landscape, and I guess the rates of change that we're seeing in the system are somewhat alarming in terms of the habitat and landscape changes and the implications that this may have in terms of habitat quality for some of these populations. And I think it's very important that we start to have some increased focus on how some of these permafrost thaw-driven landscape changes will impact the habitat extent and consequently health of the boreal caribou, but other wildlife populations. We have a number of in the minister's recent visit to Scotty Creek. We had a number of individuals from the Lidley-Coo First Nation come out, and they were telling us about trap lines that they were using in that area, and the kinds of changes they were seeing on the landscape, and expressing their real concern for the impacts that these changes that I've been showing you will have on some of these species that they're interested in trapping. So having a better understanding of how these landscape changes are going to impact caribou and other wildlife is a pretty important direction to take this research into. And with that, I'll show you a beautiful double rainbow from Scotty Creek. This is again First Lake, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and take any questions.